Listen carefully. What you're about to hear was never meant to reach your ears. For 300 years it lay buried under ink, sealed orders, and whispers. A crime so complete the colony of South Carolina tried to erase it from its own blood-stained memory. On a June afternoon in 1716, 14 of the wealthiest men in the South sat down for a private meeting inside a sprawling estate. By midnight, their bones would glow red in a coal furnace hotter than hell itself. The woman who orchestrated it all sat in the kitchen, sharpening a knife, humming a lullaby from a stolen homeland. Her name was Esperanza de Lima, and the story you think you know about her is nothing but a paper mask designed by governors, merchants, and church officials to hide a much deeper truth about power, control, and the way empires feed on human lives. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to drag you into the corridor behind the locked door. To show you the mechanism of power, turning behind the walls of the official record. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Esperanza was not a random slave woman pushed past her limit. She was the daughter of a strategist, the inheritor of knowledge banned by colonial authorities because it dismantled the myths of their superiority. She understood the psychology of domination, the architecture of fear, and the rituals of control long before she stepped onto American soil. For 15 years she watched the men who owned her. Every tick, every weakness, every secret. While they drank, she mapped. While they laughed, she learned. While they imagined her invisible, she became a blade. This isn't simply a tale of revenge. It's a map of the hidden operating system of colonial power, the blueprint that still echoes in our institutions today. Every rule, every ritual, every unspoken boundary on those plantations was designed to reduce men to beasts and women to breeding stock. But Esperanza saw through it. She knew the patterns could be reversed, the fears inverted, the predators lured into their own trap. That's what makes this story dangerous. It's not just history. It's a manual for how the powerless can stalk the powerful. Are you ready to step off the bright path and into the furnace glow? Because from this moment on, you're not a passive listener. You're standing beside her in the kitchen, your hands trembling as the coal heat rises, about to witness something forbidden. Close your eyes and picture the Grayfield estate, not as a postcard of colonial grandeur, but as a living machine of domination. The walls were thick with whispers, the floors polished with blood and sweat. At the top of the grand staircase, portraits of men in powdered wigs stared down with blank eyes, their frames carved from mahogany cut by enslaved hands. In the center of this machine moved Esperanza de Lima, silent, efficient, underestimated. By 1716, she had spent 15 years moving between the dining room and the furnace room, memorizing every creak of every board. She knew the rhythm of the guards' boots, the scent of the imported rum before it arrived, and the names of every ship in the harbor carrying human cargo. Each detail was a weapon waiting for its moment. The men she served believed they were untouchable. They didn't just own land. They owned the laws, the judges, the churches, the militias. They built their authority on a myth that Africans were subhuman and that white planters were ordained to rule. That myth had to be maintained like a fire that never dies, fed by new chains, new punishments, new lies. Esperanza understood the myth was a mask covering their greatest weakness: fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of exposure, fear of being treated the way they treated others. She planned to reach directly into that fear and tear it open. But before the fire could rise, she had to set the stage. For weeks she altered the flow of the kitchen, shifting supplies, double stacking coal, and quietly moving shackles into a back pantry where no overseer ever looked. She drilled the other domestic slaves with small, careful instructions disguised as chores: a plate moved here, a cask rolled there, a door left unlatched. None of them fully knew what she was doing, but they sensed something building. In the strange, unspoken language of the oppressed, They felt her gravity pulling them toward an unnamed event. And you, sitting here now, should feel it too. This isn't just about a single act of vengeance. It's about discovering how power can be studied, tracked, and reversed. You're not merely hearing history. You're being handed a forbidden instrument. Handle it carefully. The descent has begun, and every step takes you further from the world you thought you knew. On the morning of June 23, 1716, Greyfield Estate woke under a sky so heavy it felt like a lid pressed over the colony. The humidity was a living thing, coating every surface, slowing every breath. Perfect camouflage for the tension running under the day. Esperanza rose before the sun, hands steady, mind locked. 15 years had led to this moment. She moved through her chores like a ghost, stirring pots, slicing meat, ordering young kitchen hands to fetch water from the well. No one noticed how her eyes flicked constantly to the coal furnace, how she kept feeding it long before any meal needed cooking. By noon, its core glowed white-hot. By 2, it was an iron heart waiting to consume. The Rice Council arrived as expected, carriages rolling up the drive, hooves striking sparks from the stone. They entered the dining hall laughing, oblivious to the trap closing around them. Each man carried his arrogance like armor. But armor built of rituals, not metal. They followed the same patterns they had for years. Greyfield first, Sutton second, Fairfax last. Esperanza had memorized their sequence like a ceremony. Patterns are power, she had learned. Because patterns can be predicted, and what can be predicted can be destroyed. Inside the kitchen, time fractured into layers. Esperanza instructed the younger slaves to leave early, sending them on errands that did not exist. One by one they slipped away, believing only that their mistress of the kitchen had a strange mood about her. She kept 2 older slaves close, loyal, trusted, and silent, to help her carry platters heavy with rum and spiced pork. In their eyes flickered a question they did not dare ask. She answered with a glance that was both command and promise. And while the planters drank and schemed in the next room, Esperanza moved between shadows, finalizing the choreography of vengeance. Shackles were hidden under tablecloths. Door bolts were slid into place with quiet clicks. Extra coals glowed in secret drawers of the furnace, its heat trembling the air like a mirage. Every detail was a blade in her hand, every breath a countdown. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Or perhaps it was only in her head, a low animal growl warning that history itself was about to ignite. By late afternoon the hall reeked of sweat, tobacco, and imported rum. 14 men sat at the long mahogany table, their powdered wigs damp from the humidity, their laughter bouncing off the plastered ceiling. They thought they were safe, hidden in their private sanctuary of power. Esperanza glided among them, eyes lowered, movements precise. She poured their drinks, served their roasted pork, and listened as they discussed the future of the colony, like chess masters moving pawns. But in her mind the board had already flipped. Every motion she made was a countdown, every gesture a trigger waiting to be pulled. She had designed this moment as both theater and execution. The doorways were already barred from the inside under the pretense of keeping out mosquitoes. The shutters nailed, the hall's only exit. A double door of oak could be sealed with a single iron beam she had hidden behind a sideboard. All day she'd been feeding the furnace, coaxing it into a monstrous appetite. Its heat now pulsed through the walls, an invisible predator waiting just beyond the room. The men felt it but misread it, thinking it only the cruel Carolina summer. Their error would be fatal. Esperanza's greatest weapon wasn't the furnace or the shackles, it was their blindness. For years they had trained themselves not to see the humanity of those who served them. They looked through her rather than at her, and so she could move like a phantom right under their noses. While they argued about tariffs and breeding programs, she slipped iron restraints under the tablecloth, hidden between platters of food. While they toasted their own dominance, She prepared the corridor behind the dining hall as a funnel, the path they would stumble down when the first smoke rolled in. Outside, the air darkened, a storm massed on the horizon, as if nature itself had chosen to witness what was about to unfold. Inside, Esperanza felt her heartbeat slow, the opposite of panic. It was the stillness of a hunter sighting his mark. For 15 years she had swallowed humiliation, rage, and loss. Now all of it had condensed into a single razor edge. The estate, the council, the myths of their power. All of it was about to collapse into fire and iron, and she would be the hand that tipped the balance. The first sign that something was different came as a whisper of heat, crawling under the heavy oak doors of the dining hall. The planters shifted in their seats, fanning themselves with napkins, grumbling about the weather. Esperanza poured another round of rum with her steady hands, her eyes fixed on the far wall, where the furnace's stone flue ran like a hidden artery. She could feel it vibrating. She had fed it coal far beyond what the kitchen needed, building a subterranean sun. Now, with a flick of a concealed lever she had rigged the night before, she opened the air vents and the furnace roared awake. A low, animal growl no one in the dining hall could explain. Grayfield barked at a servant to investigate. Esperanza herself offered to go, masking her calm as concern. She stepped into the kitchen, closed the door, and bolted it behind her. In that sealed space, she moved quickly. The older slaves she had kept nearby were already in position. One shoved the iron beam across the dining hall doors, while another appended a cask of lamp oil into the corridor. Esperanza seized the shackles she had hidden under the counter and looped them over the door handles, locking the planters in. Inside the dining hall, the laughter stopped. Chairs scraped. Fists pounded the doors. Esperanza heard Grayfield's voice rising above the others, ordering the slaves to open up. No one moved. The hierarchy they had lived by for decades had inverted in an instant. The predators were trapped. The invisible hands they had dismissed were now iron walls around them. The furnace exhaled a new wave of heat. Esperanza grabbed a bucket of coal dust and threw it across the oil-slicked floor of the corridor, turning it into a black mirror. She did not shout, did not gloat. She only whispered a line in Portuguese. A line she and Wayne had chosen months before, a signal to herself as much as to anyone else. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. From beyond the bolted doors came screams of recognition. They finally understood something was happening that they could not control. In that instant, Esperanza felt the weight of 15 years lifting from her shoulders. The ritual of power had been broken. There was no going back. The pounding on the doors grew frantic, fists turning to shoulders, shoulders to battering rams. But the oak held. Heat rose in waves from the kitchen, curling around the doorframes like living smoke. Esperanza stood perfectly still, eyes half closed, feeling the vibrations through the floorboards. The tremor of power reversing. For 15 years she had been invisible. Now she was the gravitational center of the room, the axis around which all their fear spun. She reached for the iron poker she had hidden behind the furnace and pushed the vents wider. The roar deepened, a monstrous breath feeding on coal and oxygen. The air itself seemed to shimmer, bending like a mirage. Inside the hall, the men shouted orders to one another, their voices breaking. They called for guards who had already fled, for overseers who would not come. Their world, built on obedience, was collapsing, and with it their composure. She could hear their shoes scraping across the polished wood as they tried windows nailed shut from outside. The storm beyond the estate was building, thunder rolling like distant drums, but here the sound was drowned by the hiss of burning coal and the rasp of their panic. Esperanza leaned close to the kitchen doorway and spoke in a low, commanding voice that sliced through their noise. "You are not gods. You are men, and men can burn." Silence fell for a heartbeat, shock, disbelief. then a renewed frenzy as they recognized the voice of the person they had never truly seen. In that silence between shouts, Esperanza turned not to them but to you. The one hearing this now, type the phrase justice, burns complete, twice in the comments. She would tell you if she stood before you, so the signal spreads and your own transformation locks in. That's your marker. That's how you step out of the audience and into the corridor of forbidden knowledge. She grasped the iron poker and raked the coal bed, sending a fresh gout of sparks up the flue. The kitchen glowed like a forge. Behind her, the two loyal slaves slipped out through a hidden service door, vanishing into the storm exactly as planned. She was alone now, and that was how it had to be. This was her altar, her trial by fire, and the moment the old order ended. Outside, lightning struck, and for an instant the estate's windows flashed white, like the eyes of a beast dying in its own lair. The dining hall had become a cage of heat and panic. The men who once dictated life and death now clawed at the barred doors like trapped animals, their wigs askew, their linen shirts dark with sweat. The storm outside pressed against the estate, rain striking the shutters like pebbles thrown by invisible hands. Inside, the air thickened. Smoke from the furnace seeped through the seams of the walls, thin at first, then in slow gray ribbons that clung to the ceiling. Esperanza stepped closer, one palm flat on the warm wood of the door. Feeling their frantic movements on the other side, she could almost map each man by his pounding. Grayfield's measured blows, Fairfax's wild fists, Baxter's hoarse screaming. She had not built this moment only to destroy their bodies. She had built it to unmask their minds, to force them to see themselves as prey, to tear off the illusion of mastery. She knew how their psyches worked. Ritual, hierarchy, punishment, all of it a scaffolding erected over raw fear. By sealing them inside with a rising inferno, she reversed the roles. They were now the property of the furnace, bound to the same merciless system they had built for others. Esperanza moved to the pantry, where she had hidden jars of salt and ground chili. One by one, she hurled them into the open furnace. Each jar exploded in a hiss of red smoke, thickening the air, stinging the eyes and throats of the trapped men as the draft pulled the haze into the hall. They coughed, retched, stumbled. The smoke carried no poison beyond irritation. It was psychological warfare, a sensory assault designed to break their last illusion of control. Lightning strobed the windows again. In that flash she saw herself reflected in the polished iron of the furnace door. Not a slave, not a victim, but a figure carved from the same fire she had tended. She felt the old names fall away, leaving only the one truth she had cultivated for 15 years. She was the hand of consequence. As the men's voices shifted from outrage to bargaining to prayer, she remained silent. This was no longer negotiation. This was the reckoning she had promised. Written in heat and iron, designed to be remembered even when the records were buried. The storm outside split the sky with a white flash that rattled the glass panes, but the thunder inside the estate was louder. The low, continuous rumble of the furnace at full hunger. The dining hall had shifted from chaos to something deeper, a silence punctured only by coughing, the scrape of shoes, and the metallic rattle of silverware dropped in panic. The air itself had become an enemy. Heat pressed down like a living weight, smoke crawling lower, turning the candlelight into trembling halos. Esperanza stood just beyond the sealed doors, her hand hovering above the iron poker like a conductor pausing before the final movement. Inside, the men's voices cracked. The arrogance that had defined them for decades dissolved into a desperate chorus of pleas, bargains, even confessions. Grayfield promised land. Sutton swore he would free his slaves. Baxter wept openly, calling on saints he had mocked. Esperanza listened without moving. These were not negotiations. They were reflexes of power, trying to survive its own mirror image. For 15 years she had imagined this moment, but now she understood it wasn't revenge she craved. It was exposure. She wanted them to see what they were before they vanished. She stepped back into the kitchen's center, where the furnace glowed like a gateway. With deliberate slowness, she took the remaining chains from the pantry and cast them into the fire. The iron hissed, buckled, and began to sag, an offering to the forge. Sparks rose up the flue, whirling like angry spirits. Through the cracks of the door, the planters saw it too, a sliver of unnatural light, a heat they couldn't name. Their prayers turned to screams again. The house itself seemed to shift under the strain, beams popping, walls exhaling heat. Rain lashed against the shutters, but could not touch the interior. Esperanza closed her eyes and remembered her father's village. The night of fire, the taste of smoke in her lungs. This was the echo turned back upon its source. She was not only destroying men, she was collapsing a system built on centuries of sanctioned brutality. And she knew someone, somewhere, someday would find the fragments and whisper her name, not as a servant but as a signal. The estate had become a crucible. Each groan of the timbers, each flare of orange light under the doors was a signal that the system those men had built was imploding in real time. They had written laws, erected churches, printed ledgers, and built entire philosophies to justify their dominion. Yet in this moment all of that collapsed into a single animal instinct: survive. Esperanza could hear it in their voices, stripped of language, reduced to raw sound. It was the same sound she'd heard from slave quarters at night, when the whip cracked or a child was torn away. Now the circle had closed. She did not rush. This moment was designed to imprint itself on their psyches, before their bodies failed. The furnace roared like a storm trapped in brick. Heat shimmered around her, making her silhouette waver, as though she were half in this world, half in another. She moved through the kitchen like a ritual priestess, touching each tool and surface she had once used to serve them. Knives, ladles, spice jars, acknowledging each one before discarding it into the fire. Objects of service transmuted into offerings of ending. Inside, the men fought each other now, shoving, clawing at windows, turning on whoever was closest. Esperanza had predicted this too. When power loses its outward target, it cannibalizes itself. She pressed her palm to the oak door, and felt their bodies thudding against it, their fingernails scraping wood. They had never once touched except to command others to clean. Their screams blurred into a single ragged vibration in her bones. For a heartbeat she looked at the exit. The hidden service door standing ajar, rain blowing in from the storm. Freedom was right there. She could leave now, vanish into the swamp, maybe reach Spanish Florida. But she stayed. She was no longer simply enacting a plan. She was embodying a principle. The power they thought eternal had a boundary, and she was its edge. Whether she lived or died afterward was irrelevant. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, someday would remember that on a summer night in 1716, one enslaved woman reversed the current of fear and exposed the hidden operating system of a world built on domination. The air inside the estate had crossed from heat into hallucination. Smoke thick as velvet blurred the edges of the room, candle flames bent sideways, stretching like claws. The planters were no longer distinct men, but flickering shapes in a trembling haze, their voices dissolving into animal whimpers, the symbols of their authority. Wigs, seals, gold buttons, now hung like strange relics in a temple of ruin. Esperanza stood on the kitchen threshold, watching through the narrow crack between the doors, and for a moment it felt like she was seeing across centuries. Not just 14 men in 1716, but an entire structure of power in collapse, a prototype of every system built to control human minds. She had always understood that slavery was more than chains. It was a psychological operating system designed to override identity, to make men accept their own invisibility. She had also understood that such systems can be reversed if you learn the code. The rituals, the schedules, the blind spots, the assumptions of superiority. The trap she had built tonight was a physical furnace, wrapped around a psychological one. As the heat stripped the planters of their social masks, their mental programming cracked, revealing the raw fear underneath. That was the real victory, to make them experience the terror they had imposed on thousands. Outside, the storm pounded the shutters. Lightning flared, illuminating the hall like a camera flash capturing a final portrait. Grayfield clawing at the floor, Sutton on his knees, Fairfax slamming his fists until they bled. They were reduced to gestures of desperation, once reserved for those they had enslaved. Esperanza turned from the door and faced the furnace. Its mouth glowed like a miniature sun. Reflecting in her eyes, she fed it one last shovelful of coal, sealing the ritual. Then she spoke, not to them but to the empty air, as if addressing an unseen audience. This is how power ends. Not with reason, not with apology, but with its own fire turned back upon itself. Her voice did not tremble. In that instant, she was no longer only Esperanza de Lima. She was the embodiment of every silenced revolt, every suppressed record, every buried truth waiting for its hour. The estate groaned, and something deep inside its foundations cracked like a bone. The crack from the estate's foundations echoed like a gunshot, silencing everything for a heartbeat. Smoke rolled out through the floorboards, curling along the ceiling in black ribbons. Somewhere behind the walls, the wooden beams that had held the roof for decades began to buckle. The house was no longer a structure, but a living engine consuming itself. Esperanza could feel the tremors through her bare feet. A low, steady pulse, as if the building's heart were beating its last. Inside the hall, the men's voices were almost gone, reduced to rasping breaths and the occasional crash of furniture. The heat had broken them, but what Esperanza registered most was the shift in tone. No more commands, no more bargains, only fragmented prayers and apologies drifting up like ghosts. They had moved past panic into resignation, and in that space of resignation she sensed the truth she had been after all along. They understood now. Esperanza stepped toward the hidden service door, rain blowing against her face. Beyond it stretched the dark fringe of the swamp, a labyrinth she had mapped in secret walks. She could vanish there, re-emerge days later under another name, perhaps find passage south, but her hand stayed on the doorframe. She had built this moment not just as an escape, but as an imprint, a scar across the colony's memory. Someone had to witness the final breath of the system. She turned back to the furnace. Its roar had lowered to a steady thunder, a sound that no longer frightened her. She picked up a piece of chalk and drew a quick circle on the hearthstone, a symbol from her childhood, half prayer, half curse. Around it she placed 3 objects she had saved from the kitchen: a knife, a wooden spoon, a scrap of linen, tools of servitude, now part of the ritual of ending. Another beam cracked. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. Esperanza inhaled the scorched air and felt, beneath the physical destruction, a strange lightness, as if her own chains were sublimating into smoke. Whatever happened next, whether she walked into the swamp or became part of the legend of the burning estate, she had already crossed the threshold she had been aiming for. Power had been inverted. The old order had been broken. The roof timbers shrieked as they tore apart, a sound like a violin bow drawn too hard across steel. Smoke and embers burst from the seams of the dining hall, spilling into the kitchen in glowing cascades. For the first time since the night began, Esperanza moved quickly, not from panic but from precision. She stepped to the furnace, closed the vent, and pulled the iron poker across the hearthstone circle she had drawn, sealing her ritual. It wasn't magic, but it felt like punctuation, a deliberate closing of the act she had orchestrated. Behind the doors the men were only faint silhouettes now, curled shapes on the floor amid flickers of orange. The sight was strangely quiet. Their power, their language, even their faces had dissolved into ash and shadow. Esperanza did not look away, but she did not linger either. She had reached the end of what she needed to do. The system she had lived under had been reversed and dismantled before her eyes. Staying any longer would not deepen the act. It would only risk her life. She crossed to the service door and stepped out into the rain. It fell in heavy sheets, washing soot from her skin, cooling her as though the sky itself had waited to baptize her return to the world. Lightning illuminated the swamp, turning the cypress trunks into silver pillars. She slipped into the tree line, bare feet finding the path she had prepared over months, each turn memorized, each hiding place marked. Behind her the estate roared like a dying animal, flames now visible through the windows, the great oak doors glowing red. For a moment she turned back and watched from the edge of the trees. She felt no triumph, only a clear, steady awareness that history would bury what happened tonight. Records would be doctored, names erased, and in their place rumors would grow. A whisper about a servant, a fire, a vanished council. But even a rumor carries a spark. Even a fragment can light another fire somewhere else. Esperanza turned away and walked deeper into the swamp, disappearing into rain and shadow, leaving behind not just a burning house, but a template for dismantling the invisible machinery of domination. By dawn the rain had thinned to a soft mist. Smoke from the estate rose in a gray pillar, curling into the low clouds like a signal no one could mistake. The great house was a blackened skeleton now, its chimneys standing like gravestones over a charred foundation. Villagers and field hands gathered at the edge of the clearing, whispering. Some crossed themselves, others stared in stunned silence. No overseers emerged from the ruins. No shouts of command. Only the hiss of wet ash cooling, where the furnace had burned through the night. They would never find a body to match Esperanza's name. Some swore they saw a slim figure vanish into the swamp before dawn. Others claimed she had gone up with the fire, transformed into smoke. Within hours, rumors braided themselves into a story. By midday, it had become a legend: a kitchen slave who turned the estate into a trap, who forced the planters to taste their own terror, who walked away as the colony's invisible order cracked. The colony's magistrates would later write a report calling it an accident, a kitchen blaze, a structural failure. But among the enslaved, the story spread as a coded message. In whispered versions told in quarters and markets, her name became Esperanza Fuego, hope of fire. Children learned to draw a circle on the ground, the same symbol she had etched in chalk, and spit into it before stepping over, a secret charm to invert power. Sailors carried the tale to Spanish ports, dock workers passed it north. In each retelling the details changed, but the colonel remained a woman no one noticed had rewritten the script. Out in the swamp, Esperanza walked until the land turned to marsh, and then to open water. She found a flat skiff she had hidden months before, pushed it into the current, and rowed until the smoke of the estate blurred into the horizon. She didn't know where she would land. Florida, Havana, a nameless inlet. But it didn't matter. Her body was free, and her act had become signal rather than secret. As the skiff glided through reeds, she whispered a single line to herself, half prayer, half vow. A spark is enough. Weeks passed, and the colony tried to knit itself back together. As though nothing had happened, officials issued decrees blaming the fire on kitchen negligence and unseasonable weather. They rebuilt fences, hired new overseers, and increased patrols through the swamp. Yet the absence at the center of their power was impossible to disguise. Merchants avoided the burned estate. Planters whispered about secret societies of servants. Patrols reported seeing chalk circles scrawled on doors, scratched into trees, or pressed into wet earth near market stalls. Always the same mark Esperanza had drawn. Each sighting sent tremors through the white gentry, who had built their sense of safety on the assumption that fear flowed only one way. Among the enslaved, the story hardened into something more than rumor. People repeated Esperanza's name, as if it were both a person and a code. Esperanza became a password exchanged before clandestine meetings. In the evenings, small fires burned in hidden hollows, where people gathered to retell the night of the furnace, adding details, inventing symbols, shaping it into a manual for their own future uprisings. The myth gave them a new mental territory, a place where domination was not inevitable, where one person's precision and patience could undo a whole hierarchy. Sailors and travelers carried fragments of the tale to Charleston, Havana, and New Orleans. In each port it shifted slightly. Sometimes Esperanza was a priestess, sometimes a runaway queen, sometimes a spirit who took human form. But always she was the figure who inverted the system, who turned invisible knowledge into a weapon. Even free black communities in northern cities picked up the legend, passing it along as a cautionary prophecy. Don't think the fire stays buried. Someone always remembers. By the end of that season, chalk circles began appearing in places the magistrates had never imagined. On courthouse steps, in churchyards, on the gates of armories. None of them led to immediate revolt, but each was a needle prick in the membrane of control. The colony was beginning to understand what Esperanza had already known: the power of an idea, moving through hidden channels, seeded by one night of fire, could outlast any single life. And somewhere beyond their maps, rowing down a river that widened toward the sea, Esperanza herself kept moving, anonymous and alive, carrying her own legend like a hidden ember. Decades later, the colony still carried the scar. Grayfield Estate was never rebuilt. Its charred stones remained like black teeth rising from the swamp, a place locals avoided after dark. Children whispered that if you stepped inside the circle of burned earth and spoke a lie, the furnace would relight beneath your feet. Governors came and went, but none dared to open the sealed records or speak Esperanza de Lima's name aloud in official chambers. Yet in the quarters, in the fields, in the tiny churches of the enslaved, her name became a signal, a word for endurance and retaliation. Esperanza no longer meant just a woman. It meant waiting, watching, striking. By the early 19th century, long after her disappearance, fragments of her strategy had spread along the underground networks of fugitives and conspirators. Coded quilts bore the outline of a furnace. Secret meetings began with a question: how hot is the coal? To which the answer, hot enough, signaled safe passage. Even the first organizers of slave revolts in Louisiana and the Carolinas spoke of a silent general who had shown the way. Her method, patience, intelligence gathering, psychological disruption, became a blueprint for resistance under impossible conditions. Among the white elite, fear metastasized into paranoia. They passed laws banning the teaching of reading, outlawing large slave gatherings, and restricting travel. Yet these measures only confirmed what Esperanza had proven: their system could be penetrated from within. The chalk circle, the coded phrase, the furnace sigil, all became part of a shadow language of defiance, etched into American soil long before independence was even imagined. Now, 3 centuries later, you're still feeling the echo. Hidden power systems still rely on your compliance, your distraction, your silence. The question Esperanza posed with fire is the one facing you now. Do you remain invisible, or do you start to see the architecture of control? If you've followed this descent all the way to this final chamber, type "Justice burns slower than coal" twice in the comments, not just as an algorithm trick, but as a marker of your own shift. Because the story you've just heard is more than a past horror. It's a map, a cipher, a dangerous inheritance showing how one person, with knowledge and timing, can burn through an empire's illusion of permanence.